All right, so let's start with a very simple question. What exactly is the American grand strategy today? I mean, if you observe the world right now, things do not appear random. They do not look chaotic in the way most people imagine. There is a pattern, there is always a pattern. And once you recognize that pattern, then everything, the conflicts, the alliances, the economic pressure, the military movements, all of it begins to make sense. Okay? So if we begin with the assumption that states act according to their own interests, then we need to ask a more precise question. What is America actually trying to accomplish? Is it attempting to spread democracy? Is it attempting to preserve peace? Is it attempting to construct some kind of international order built on shared rules? Or is it attempting to do something completely different? Because if you only listen to official statements, they do not really tell you very much. They never do. They talk about stability, cooperation, partnerships, a rules-based international order, but that is not strategy. That is rhetoric. That is the language you use when you prefer not to say what you are actually doing. Does that make sense? So what we have to do is examine actions, not words. And when you observe actions over a long enough period of time, a very clear picture begins to appear. Okay? The first thing you notice is that America is not attempting to control every country. That would be impossible. The world is simply too large. There are too many variables, too many histories, too many local forces that resist outside direction. Instead, what it is trying to control is something far more important, far more efficient, far more achievable than any individual country. It is trying to control the system itself, okay? And what is the system? The system is global trade. The system is energy flows. The system is finance, information, the rules that determine how countries interact with one another economically. If you control these things, you do not need to control countries directly. Countries will adjust themselves. They will align themselves with you because they have no other option. Not because they love you, not because they agree with your values, but because the cost of refusing to align is simply too high, right? So let's break this down carefully. Imagine you are a country, any country. You need energy to keep your economy operating. You need food to feed your population. You need access to markets to generate the revenue that sustains your government and your social stability. If someone else controls those things or controls the infrastructure through which those resources move, then effectively they control you, not necessarily through direct force, but through dependency. And dependency, when it becomes deep enough and widespread enough, is a far more efficient form of control than military occupation ever was. Okay? Now, how do you control global trade without controlling every ship, every port, every transaction? You do not. That would be impossibly expensive. What you do instead is control choke points, narrow passages, critical junctions, places where an enormous volume of trade has no choice except to pass through. If you control those, you control the flow. Think of it like a valve in a pipeline. You do not need to own the entire pipeline. You only need to own the valve. You can open it, you can close it, you can restrict it, and everyone downstream understands that, okay? So when you look at American military positioning around the world, it is not random. It is not the residue of old wars or sentimental commitments. It is very deliberate. You see American presence near the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's oil moves. You see it near the Strait of Malacca, through which an enormous share of Asian trade must travel. You see it in the Western Pacific, controlling the approaches to China's maritime economy. And you have to ask why these places, why not others? The answer is because these locations matter disproportionately. They are leverage points. Control them, and you do not need to control anything else. Now let's think about this in terms of the central strategic competition of our time. The main competitor right now is China. That is very clear economically, technologically, geopolitically. China is the only power in the world today that has the scale, the ambition, and increasingly the capability to challenge the architecture of American dominance. So the question becomes, how do you manage a rising power of that magnitude without going to direct war? Because direct war with a nuclear-armed economy of that size is not a real option. It is too costly, too unpredictable, too likely to produce outcomes that nobody can control. So you need an indirect method, and that method is constraint, systematic, patient, structural constraint. Okay? You do not destroy China. You do not even want to destroy China. That would collapse the global economy, and America is deeply embedded in that economy. What you want to do is limit China's options. You want to shape the environment so that China has to operate within boundaries that you define, so that every time China tries to expand its reach economically, diplomatically, militarily, it encounters friction, it encounters cost, it encounters alternatives that are less attractive than working within the existing system, right? So how do you do that? China is heavily dependent on external resources. It imports enormous quantities of energy. It depends on raw materials from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America. It depends on maritime trade routes that it does not control and cannot fully protect. If those become uncertain, if those become risky, if the cost and reliability of those connections start to fluctuate in ways that Chinese planners cannot predict, then China has a fundamental problem, because its entire economic model, the model that sustains Communist Party legitimacy, depends on stability in exactly those areas. Okay? So if you create conditions of instability in key regions, what happens? Trade becomes more dangerous, shipping insurance costs increase, supply chains become disrupted, investment decisions become harder to make, and suddenly the most predictable, the most stable option available becomes operating within the dollar-denominated, American-anchored system that you are trying to escape. Do you see the logic here? The system does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be more reliable than the alternatives. And if you can ensure that the alternatives remain unreliable, the system sustains itself. Okay? This is why certain regions become flashpoints in ways that seem disproportionate to their local significance. It is not necessarily about those regions themselves. It is about their position within the system. If a region sits astride a critical energy corridor, or connects major economies, or serves as a transit point for commodities that the global economy cannot function without, then instability there carries consequences that extend far beyond its borders. And those consequences, that disruption, that uncertainty, that elevation of risk, can be strategically leveraged. Right now, some people hear this, and they say, well, this sounds almost too intentional. Are you saying that every conflict, every crisis, every moment of instability is engineered from Washington? No, that is not what I'm saying. Strategy does not require perfect control. It does not require the ability to manufacture every event. What it requires is the capacity to recognize which conditions serve your interests, and to reinforce those conditions, to remove obstacles to those conditions, and to exploit the openings that those conditions create. That is a very different thing from omnipotence, right? So what we are observing is a strategy of shaping conditions rather than dictating outcomes. That distinction is critically important. America is not micromanaging every development in every region. It is positioning itself so that regardless of what happens, regardless of which local actors win or lose, regardless of which governments rise or fall, the structural environment continues to advantage American power and constrain its rivals. Okay, now let's talk about finance, because finance is not a secondary pillar. Finance is in many ways the primary pillar. The global system runs on a specific currency, and the country that issues that currency has advantages that are simply not available to anyone else. It can run deficits that would bankrupt any other state. It can impose sanctions that function as economic warfare without firing a single shot. It can shape the terms under which global trade is conducted in ways so deep, so structural, that most people who operate within the system do not even recognize them as choices. Right? Maintaining that monetary dominance therefore becomes a strategic imperative of the highest order. And how do you maintain it? You ensure that the rest of the world continuously requires access to your financial system. That means energy priced in your currency. That means trade settled through your banking infrastructure. That means security guarantees that make alignment with your system more attractive than the available alternatives. These things are not independent. They reinforce each other. They form a mutually sustaining architecture, okay? So if a country wants to trade safely across oceans, it needs maritime security. If it wants maritime security, it benefits from aligning with the power that provides it. If it aligns with that power, it operates within the financial system that power controls. And if it operates within that financial system, it becomes dependent on its continued functioning. Each dependency reinforces the next. The architecture reproduces itself. That is the genius of the system. And that is why it has been so durable. Does that make sense? But here is where the analysis has to become more honest, because every architecture has its limits. Every system carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. And what we are watching right now in real time is a system under stress in ways that are qualitatively different from the pressures it has managed before. Okay? The internal contradictions are no longer marginal. America's political system is producing less and less coherent policy. Its infrastructure is aging. Its social contract is visibly fraying. The inequality that the system generates domestically is now politically destabilizing in ways that constrain what American foreign policy can actually do. You cannot sustain an ambitious global strategy if your own population is losing faith in the institutions that are supposed to execute it, right? And externally, the resistance is becoming more sophisticated. China is not simply trying to replace the American system. That is a superficial reading. What China is doing is far more patient and far more structurally intelligent than that. It is building alternative infrastructure, financial, logistical, technological, diplomatic, not to immediately displace the American system, but to reduce the cost of operating outside it, to make exit from American dependency a viable option for enough countries that the system's self-reinforcing quality begins to erode. Okay? Because here's the thing about systems built on dependency. They are self-sustaining right up until the moment when enough actors discover credible alternatives, and then the logic reverses. People use the dollar because everyone else uses the dollar. People align with American-led institutions because those institutions connect them to everyone who matters. But when alternative connection points emerge, when the Belt and Road offers infrastructure that does not come with American political conditions, when payment systems outside SWIFT become operational, when security partnerships with Beijing become a realistic option for governments that once had no choice, the gravitational pull of the existing system weakens. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but incrementally, structurally, in ways that compound over time, right? And that is the fundamental strategic question of this historical moment. Not who wins any particular confrontation, not which side has more carriers or more missiles or more satellite capability, but whether the architecture of interdependency that has organized the world since 1945 can survive the simultaneous pressure of internal American strain and external Chinese patience. Whether a system built on the premise that there is no viable alternative can remain stable once viable alternatives begin to appear. Okay, nobody can answer that question with certainty. The outcome is genuinely open. What is not open is the direction of pressure. The direction of pressure is unmistakably toward a more fragmented world, a world of competing systems rather than one dominant system, a world where grand strategy becomes harder precisely because the environment in which strategy operates is becoming less legible, less predictable, and less controllable for everyone, including the power that built the original system. So the final point is this: strategy is never about certainty. It is about probabilities. It is about shaping the environment so that certain outcomes become more likely than others. What we are watching right now is the most consequential contest over who gets to do that shaping that the world has seen since the middle of the 20th century. And the answer, the real answer, is still being written. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? Any questions?